The next morning, Duck was asleep and alone in his shed. Oliver was already out of his first passenger train, and Duck's first train wasn't due for another 2 hours. Just then, he awoke to a familiar whistle.
Odd,
he thought.
What's Henry doing up here?
Henry stopped outside the shed, and out of his cab stepped the Fat Controller. "Morning, Duck," he said. "We'd like to talk with you,"
Oh, yes, sir.
replied Duck nervously.
What is it?
We want to know where you got those tenders,
said Henry calmly. Duck gulped.
What happened?
"James and the twins have acted strangely ever since they were given those tenders," explained the Fat Controller. "Henry told me that last night they were acting as if possessed by demons."
Oh my! Are they okay?
Henry looked down at his buffers.
well, they did eventually return to their normal selves, but they were deluded. They didn't seem to understand what just happened to them. They're still in the shed, but they've been uncoupled from the tenders, just to be safe.
"Now, Duck," continued the Fat Controller, "I understand these tenders were the same ones you once used to trick Henry many years ago, and that you yourself were the one to bring them onto the island from a diesel on the other railway. I want to know, what did this diesel say about them?" Duck sighed.
I didn't believe the stories at first. I thought they were silly ghost stories, but I realised I might have been wrong.
The Fat Controller and Henry waited patiently for Duck to continue.
According to the diesel, those tenders belong to 6 engines in the eastern region. These engines had, rather extreme accidents during the 1950s. They were damaged beyond repair and were naturally scrapped. Sometimes, tenders of scrapped engines are reused for other purposes. They could act as spares or to be used to store things like boiler sludge. These 6 tenders, however, were, different.
The Fat Controller frowned. How so?
Well, based on the story, strange things happened in the yards those tenders were in. Workmen sometimes claimed they would see engines coupled up to them during their night shifts, but that couldn't be proven. That wasn't all, however. Some engines, when passing through the yards, said they could hear whistles and voices when there was no one around but them and their crews. These strange events carried on for quite some time, but what put an end to it was when a tank engine was asked to move one of the tenders from its siding to another. As it did so, however, it suddenly tipped over. No one knew why or how. The engine was in good working order, and so was the track. Eventually, the strange behaviour surrounding the tenders was given more attention. The very diesel who collected them was the one I met at the station on the mainland, and he told me everything.
"I see," said the Fat Controller grimly. "But why did you bring those tenders here?"
I didn't think much of the diesel story. I offered to take them off him to lighten his load, and he was thankful. I just simply wanted to help. I'm very sorry, sir.
The Fat Controller stayed silent. He thought about all he had heard. Henry, however, felt very cross.
You should have known better, Duck. Even if it wasn't true, you still shouldn't have obtained them without telling the Fat Controller. You're lucky. It was just James and the twins that were affected.
"That will do, Henry," interrupted the Fat Controller. "Duck, what has happened as of late was not your fault. Indeed, you should have informed me about these tenders before bringing them onto the island. But it would be very unfair to blame you. Thank you for telling me everything. I know what to do." He turned to Henry. "Henry, please collect all the tenders and take them to the scrapyard. and silent. He didn't blame Henry for what he had said. He had every right to be cross. He only hoped, though, that he would be forgiven soon. It took some time, but eventually, Henry's train for the scrapyard was ready. A single truck was placed between the tenders and his own, just to be safe. He sat in the yard, waiting to go. He looked over at the sheds. James and the twins had been given back their original tenders, and were still in the process of recovering.
How are you feeling?
I was just trying to explain everything to them.
Gordon said.
And I honestly can't believe a single bit.
Puffed James.
I actually liked pulling trucks.
Indeed you did. It was honestly a nice change. And a scary one. Still, it's good to see you back to how you really are.
It was a long, silent journey. Henry was lost in his thoughts. About the tenders, about their story, and most importantly, how they affected his friends. When he arrived at the scrapyard, he found the Fat Controller talking to some workmen. Ah, Henry, glad you got them here safely. I was just explaining the situation. They will get to work straight away.
That's good to hear that, sir.
Replied Henry quietly. The Fat Controller looked up at the green engine, taking note of his very downcast look. About earlier, he said slowly. I know you're upset, but you must know it really isn't Doug's fault. It was understandably a hard story to believe, and Doug would never want to harm anyone. Henry gave a long sigh.
I know, sir, it's just... Seeing your friends suddenly become something they're not. The more I think about it, the more I realise how scary it is.
The Fat Controller nodded. They both watched as the scrappers set to work, taking the tenders apart, piece by piece, until eventually